My understanding is that Professor Gates then shows his ID to show that this is his house. And at that point, he gets arrested for disorderly conduct, charges which are later dropped. I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home.
I remember the moment President Obama said that because I was standing in the room, and it did not seem like he was saying anything particularly controversial. He was referring to a police officer handcuffing one of the most famous academics in the country on his own front porch because he mistook the 58-year-old black man for a burglar. And yet what followed was one of the most surreal reactionary backlashes of recent memory, with conservatives inveighing against the president and ultimately managing to push him into a painfully awkward beer summit on the White House grounds, in which the professor, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and the officer were invited to have a conversation about it all. I was reminded of that story when Laura Ingraham reported today the president was inviting the students of Covington Catholic to the White House. Well, the White House immediately moved to knock that down. Both the Gates incident and the Covington Catholic incident on the Mall captured the conservative imagination, inspired passionate outrage against what the right saw as a rush to judgment. Both similar to the reaction in defense of Justice Brett Kavanaugh when he was accused by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford of sexual assault when they were both in high school. Each of those stories are quite different in the particulars. We should note the nature of the charge of wrongdoing against the white men and boys, the seriousness of the offense, the position they occupied, and details of what they did or did not do wrong. And in each case, in the specifics, there was a case surely to be marshaled on behalf of the white males accused of wrongdoing. But it's not the particulars that drive the passion that make it the lead on Trump's TV with 20-minute segments. Conservative writer David French summed it up succinctly. Last year, conservative wives looked at the furious attack on Kavanaugh and thought, that could be my husband. Now conservative moms look at the wild attempt to destroy the Covington kids and think, that could be my son. The defining conservative experience of this era is the palpable terror and rage at a social hierarchy that is threatening to tip over and land on its head. One in which those who enjoy a basic kind of American privilege, the right to due process and second chances and charitable readings of their actions and even mistakes, find themselves, seemingly without warning, tossed instead onto the unforgiving bonfire of snap judgment and harsh punishment. And I understand why they are scared of that, why they want to fight it. Because America is already the most punitive developed nation on earth. For poor people, for people of color, for those who don't have Brett Kavanaugh's pedigree or the authority of a badge or $10,000 a year to spend on private school tuition or money to hire a PR firm. We throw millions of lives onto that bonfire every year. They just don't normally look like the teenagers in MAGA hats. And the answer isn't a society that's more punitive or social media mobs doxing children, one that permanently marks for life teenagers of all social strata, but rather a society of empathy, compassion, and accountability, evenly, equitably, and justly applied. But, funnily enough, it is hard to get the modern conservative grassroots mobilized on behalf of that goal when the kids being stamped and judged and locked away don't make them think, that could be my son. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.